You hear all about the boomers. You hear endlessly about the millennials. But what about that generation sandwiched right in between them? Generation X. They're often called the forgotten middle child, and, their quiet nature might just be one of their most defining and most misunderstood characteristics.
It's a great question, right? In a world that's gotten so loud, with opinions flying everywhere, why does this one group, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, often seem to be operating on a totally different frequency? Well, to really get their silence, you have to go back to the world that raised them, or maybe more accurately, the world that kind of left them to raise themselves.
The whole story of Gen X really starts with this one powerful image: a kid walking home from school with a house key on a string around their neck. They were the original latchkey generation. And if you can understand that term, you can understand everything.
So what is a latchkey kid? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a kid who lets themselves into an empty house after school. For millions of kids in the 70s and 80s, the sound of that front door closing wasn't followed by a parent's voice. It was just silence. And this wasn't some rare thing, not at all. It was a massive cultural phenomenon.
Now, it's really important to get this. This wasn't some deliberate parenting choice people were making. The empty house was a direct result of huge, sweeping changes that were happening across society. It was the product of a world that was seriously in flux. So you had this perfect storm of three huge forces all converging at once. First, in the 1970s, divorce rates just went through the roof, completely changing the idea of the nuclear family. At the exact same time, women were entering the workforce in numbers nobody had ever seen before. And then, by the 80s, economic pressure was so intense that for many families, having two incomes wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. And the result of all that? Nobody was home.
The scale of this is it's staggering. By the early 1980s, estimates suggest that as many as 40% of school-aged children were unsupervised for at least part of the day. Think about that. Almost half a generation was coming home to an empty house, totally responsible for themselves, until a parent finally got home from work.
So when you're faced with that reality, day in and day out, what happens? An entire generation developed this core skill set just built around self-sufficiency. They learned how to make their own snacks, how to get their homework done without somebody looking over their shoulder, and how to solve their own little problems. They just learned to fend for themselves. And that lesson, that would shape their entire worldview. And this whole experience is what created that silence we talked about at the beginning. See, it's not just about being quiet. It's a deep psychological imprint that was forged in all those empty after-school hours, and it really breaks down into three core components. First up is this sense of radical independence. When you're the one who has to figure out how to fix the TV antenna or what to make for dinner from a can of soup, you learn a really powerful lesson. If you want something done, you've just got to do it yourself. This isn't arrogance. It's just a fundamental, baked-in operating principle.
The second piece is emotional containment. I mean, if there's no adult around to vent to after you have a bad day at school, what do? You learn to deal with it on your own. You learn to just sit with your feelings, to work through them inside your own head. Now, to outsiders, this can look like being aloof or even unemotional, but really, it's just a highly developed muscle for self-regulation.
And number 3 is a deep-seated skepticism. This generation grew up watching huge institutions, everything from marriage to the economy, go through these massive, chaotic changes. They saw Watergate, the Challenger disaster. The big lesson they learned was to question pretty much everything and to only trust what you can see and verify for yourself. They have a built-in BS detector.
This quote just sums it up perfectly. It's not a complaint, not at all. It's just a statement of fact that really captures that whole experience. That kind of pragmatism, that quiet acceptance of how things are, that's the absolute essence of the Gen X mindset.
So, fast forward to today. How does that childhood show up in adulthood? Well, these traits are still playing out because that latchkey kid is now the adult in the room. They're running companies, they're raising families, and they're shaping the world we live in. One of the most fascinating results of all this is what you could call the parenting paradox. You have an entire generation that was raised with almost zero structure, and what do they often do? They become the helicopter parents, the lawnmower parents. They tend to be hyper-involved, super protective, creating this incredibly structured childhood that they themselves never had. It's a complete direct reaction to their own upbringing. And what about in the workplace? Oh yeah, these traits are impossible to miss. Gen Xers are adaptable because, well, they had to be. They work best on their own, so please, whatever you do, do not micromanage them. They have zero time for corporate buzzwords or meetings that should have been an email. Just give them a problem, get out of their way, and let them get it done.
So when you look at it all, what's the final verdict on this silence? It's really not as simple as being good or bad. It's more like a complex inheritance, something passed down that has these incredible strengths, but also some potential drawbacks.
Which brings us right to the final and I think most critical question. Is this silence a superpower, or is it a scar? Is that radical self-reliance an engine for incredible competence, or is it a barrier that keeps them from asking for help? Is that emotional containment a source of deep resilience, or is it a path to isolation? The answer, I think, is probably yes. It's both.
And maybe that's the real takeaway here. In a world that just will not stop talking, maybe the quietest generation, the one that learned to get comfortable and listen to the silence of an empty house, has the most to teach the rest of us about resilience, about pragmatism, and about the quiet strength of just getting things done.